And I think that issue is becoming very, very dangerous with European countries now deprived of American supplies of weaponry, developing their own means of assisting Ukraine to conduct long-range strikes into Russia on the assumption, which I think is going to be proven wrong, that they have immunity from retaliation. I think particularly the British, who've been boasting about their development of new weaponry for Ukraine that does not have American components and therefore is independent of Donald Trump and the United States, but will enable Ukraine to strike again deeper into Russia. I think, they're going to have a mafia moment. Nice factory you have here. Too bad if something happened to it. I suspect sabotage is the first step. I don't think we'll see a Russian missile strike on that factory, but who knows? I think at this point, NATO is in sufficient disarray that Article 5 is not a very credible deterrent. So I'm very concerned about the dynamic that has been set up. And meantime, the Europeans continue to debate. Actually, they are beginning to discuss, that's positive, the idea of actually talking to Russia. Obviously talking to Russia, according to some Europeans, is a sellout. You shouldn't do that, Why should you talk to the devil? Well, the answer is that if you don't talk to the devil may do devilish things to you. And you have no influence whatsoever over what the devil does. So we're seeing an escalation and counter-escalation cycle reach a higher level in the case of Ukraine. And that is very dangerous.
Yeah. No, I also thought, well, it's becoming impossible for Russia now not to respond. And I always thought that the retaliation would either come against the Baltic states or Germany, but the UK obviously is on top of that list as well. And if you look at last year, the attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrent, the FSB, they confirmed that the MI6 had been involved in it. So
Of course.
it wouldn't be impossible for Russia to do something like this with plausible deniability, something similar, drones within the UK, which would strike critical infrastructure, military targets, but most likely production facilities, the mafia method you
Exactly.
referred to. But overall, though, the comparison between Russia and Iran is that they're both being set up by the West now for what seems to be a forever war. That is this low intensity, well, not so low in Russia, but they want to lower it to the extent where time is on NATO's side. That is the ability to gradually degrade not just Russia, but also the Iranian economy. That is, in any war or war of attrition, you measure how much pain each side is taking. But here I'm thinking, how much is Iran willing to, cede this kind of control to the United States? Because I think they know what they want to do. Indeed, the hawks in Tehran, the reason why they opposed this memorandum of understanding was because they quite sensibly, I would say, predicted that it wouldn't be implemented on the US side. And indeed, you don't really need a crystal ball or because phone call to Nostradamus, if he was still around. But Trump was already contesting the idea that, there would be any money transferred to Iran, even as the memorandum was being signed. So, why would they trust this? However,
Well, there is no trust in any of these dynamics. Let me make a few comments, if I may. First, I don't think forever wars are a strategy. I think they are an inadvertent result of the lack of strategy. That is, there are no clear objectives. Those objectives that are stated are not feasible. They are fantasy objectives. The objectives are contained in a kaleidoscope, which shifts with every moment that it turns. There's no priority set in them. Therefore, the goalposts are moved during the war. You can always find an excuse for continuing the war. There's no war termination strategy because there are no clear objectives. and no benchmarks for measuring progress. And so you've got a forever war, and it goes on and on and on, and it doesn't end. And so you have the classic recent example is, of course, Afghanistan, where no one could ever explain why we were there after the initial punitive raid on the Taliban as the hosts of Al-Qaeda. So we've all forgotten that. We went to war for women's education or something. No, it wasn't clear. A noble cause, no doubt, whatever it was. But it went on for 2 decades and produced nothing except the return of the Taliban to control in Afghanistan. So this is a forever war. I think it requires a definition, and I think I've just provided one. And it is indeed what it seems to be happening with both Ukraine and Iran, which brings me to my second point. The United States Armed Forces and those of Israel, and perhaps NATO as well, meaning the combination of European forces with American forces. These armed forces are all structured for short, victorious wars, not for wars of attrition. And we've seen the consequences of the debilitation of the military-industrial base everywhere, except Russia and Iran, which seem to have figured out how to sustain production of relevant weaponry. The war, of course, has produced some interesting new twists. As the global order, the world order, falls into disarray, we see things like Ukraine, which has developed with Chinese components an extremely effective drone production industry. They get their components from the Chinese, just like the Russians. Russians also get the Iranian components. Maybe North Korean now as well. I don't know. Anyway, the Ukrainians have become masters of drone warfare, which turns out to be the sort of warfare that the day requires. And so they are now developing military relationships, support relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, which means that they're becoming part of a substitution for these countries' previous reliance on American technology, which turns out to be unable to cope with hypersonic missiles and drones and the combination of the two, as shown by Iran. So that is an interesting twist here. Of course, Marco Rubio's visit to the Gulf notwithstanding, basically in an effort to redefine the MOU to conform to Donald Trump's fantasies about it, this does not halt the ongoing discussion between the Gulf Arabs and Iran about the post-American blockade future of the Strait of Hormuz, which is going to remain under Iranian control. There's no way to dislodge it. So one other thing about forever wars is that they turn out to be pointless. And that's pretty much the case here.